Leaving the house, the creator of the game, Satisfy, smiled happily before going to the meeting and said, "This should be quite interesting." Lying in front of Asher Grid, who was living out his last seconds, he said in a hoarse voice that he would have really killed for this just for using the item. "Why the hell did you really chase me? You knew everything from the beginning." Trying to find out the truth as well as say what he was thinking when he had nothing to lose, Grid added dirty, "You scoundrel thief, stealing what is rightfully mine is a game though." As he took his last breaths before breaking into tiny pieces, Grid said, "Eat well and live in peace." Finishing the game after he had died once again and lost everything he had, Grid deactivated the full immersion capsule and began to crawl out of it with a groan. Taking a sitting position, the guy who had been playing the game for hours and had bags under his eyes sighed heavily and said, "It was like that." After a short pause, the guy added, "It was exciting." The next moment, he added 100 million won. "I could have earned a lot more pain." Before he could finish, he heard his mother's voice behind him saying angrily, "You saw what time it is, son." Meanwhile, somewhere in the operational headquarters of Satisfy SA Group, where a meeting was supposed to be held about the discovery and activation of the first legendary ability. Seeing that the head of the company had already arrived at his office, the head of the Satisfy task force named Choi Nahi entered his office and said, "Welcome back, sir." Hearing that his subject, the head of Satisfy, had come to him, he immediately asked, "You said that someone changed their class 5 minutes ago. I couldn't even imagine that this would happen. How interesting is this?" Immediately after these words, the chief developer of Satisfy Group SA Im Cholho got up from his seat and asked, "I hope you have managed to prepare a field report on this." A few minutes later, the head of the task force said his name was Grid. He was level 73, and he currently possessed level. His real name was Shin Yonu. Through a secret request from Count Asher, he had received the Pagma book, and according to the information department, he was an unremarkable unemployed player. Displaying statistics and other information on the screen, the girl added that he has been living in the same city for about a year now, and for the past 3 months he has been exploring the endless lands with level monsters, dying a considerable number of times. Although you told us to study the legendary class in detail, it seems to be just a singing fall that was made on his mindless play. But his addiction and certainty in the game seems to be the main factor. After hearing the report from his colleague, the chief developer leaned on his hand and said thoughtfully that he was serious. "But I thought that perseverance was a good character trait." Looking at the photo of Grid, who was the first to receive the legendary class after finding Pagma Choi's book, Nahi said thoughtfully, "Could this have happened by accident as a team leader? I can say that it is a bit disappointing." Hearing this phrase from his employee, Imchulho happily said, "Hey, you're seriously an accident. Don't make me laugh." Hearing these words from her leader, the girl replied in surprise, "Excuse me, sir." Immediately after his colleague's surprised tone, Imcholho happily added, "As you know, leader, if we look at the calculations of the Morpheus supercomputer, the North End Cave and the Pagoda Descendant should be opened in 2 years. Immediately after saying this, looking at the report Choi Nahi had prepared, the man added, however, "This guy not only entered the North Cave of the End, but he also passed the accompanying quest location of the quest item. Do you really think it was a coincidence?" Immediately after these words, pointing out one interesting detail about this guy, Imchulo added something else quite interesting, by the way, his negative level. The next moment, looking at the same piece of video when Grid was changing his class, the chief developer added that from the very beginning, Asher's quest was supposed to open at or above the level, but Grid was able to get around it, and he quickly used the item for fear that it could be taken away. Since he went through the class change, the standard legendary penalty of instant reset to the first level was immediately applied. Immediately after these words, seeing what a unique shot they got in the first use of the legendary skill, Imchulho happily added that since he failed 2 parallel quests, he lost 2 levels. Usually players at or below the level do not lose additional experience points due to death, but now he is at level. Hearing these words from the chief developer, the girl who finally realized the essence of the situation nervously exclaimed, "Wait, then what does that mean?" Interrupting his colleague without letting her finish, the chief developer confidently added, "That's right. Now you finally understand the average statistical player gets 10 points of characteristics per level, but now that he is at level." Immediately after these words, watching the boy live out his last seconds after the class change, Chulho added that he would need 2 more levels to reach the initial first level, which means he would receive an additional 20 points of characteristics, which is more points than any player of his level. Immediately after this detailed explanation of the whole situation, the lead developer confidently repeated, "Consider it all as a real accident. Isn't this a special situation? And doesn't it fit the definition of a skill?" Hearing this, the girl said anxiously, "Then it means that the balance in the game is broken. We must immediately fix it." Hearing the girl's worried voice, the man said in a calm tone of voice that there was no need to go that far. The next moment, Chulho walked over to his desk and happily added, "As you said, there's no point in worrying about such ineffective players because, besides, the descendant of Pagma is a rather weak class in combat compared to the rest of the classes." Immediately after these words, the chief developer immediately became quiet and began to stare intently at the report. Noticing this, the girl nervously asked what was wrong, sir, to which he replied nothing. "I'm going away for one day. Keep me informed." Meanwhile, in the construction office where Grid worked, the workers were being paid and the manager began to call out Mr. Shin-yan. Mr. Shin-yan. Trying to attract the guy's attention, one of the workers put his hand on his shoulder to bring him out of his trance and bring him to his senses, and then another phrase was heard. "Listen here, Shin-yonu." Drawing Grid's attention to himself, one man pointed to the boss and said, "He's talking to you. Take the money for the morning's work." And immediately afterwards, the boss repeated, "Let's all hurry up and go home." Hearing that he was ordered to come and collect the money for his work, Grid got up from his chair and went to the boss, saying, I'm sorry. I saw how strange their employee looks," one of the employees said in surprise. "You're saying this guy is a gambler." Immediately after that, the accountant who was talking to the employee behind Grid's back said, "He looks terrible and smells really bad." On his way to collect his paycheck, Grid overheard a discussion about himself behind him, in which he said, "I always thought everyone was born with at least one talent." And the other man replied, "It's a shame to be such a loser at such a young age." After collecting his paycheck for the day, Grid sat down on a bench to see how much he had received and counted the money, saying it was enough for one more round. As soon as he thought about it, a thought came into his head and he said to himself, "Just think about it. The first thing that popped into my head was the game. You should be ashamed of yourself, you fool." The next moment, tilting his head back, Grid said in frustration, "This book alone could have changed my whole life, but here I am without hundreds of millions of one." Continuing to beat himself up about the fact that he had failed again in his attempt to get rich, Grid said in frustration, "I spent so much time in this place, all this work to finish on a level." Passing by Grid, who was the first to receive the legendary class, Chulho thoughtfully said in his head, "Of course there is nothing special about this player." Flying past him in his car on the way home, the head developer added in his head, "But to be honest, watching the road while driving, even while he was thinking, Chulho confidently added, "However, I think that's the advantage, but of course he'll have to figure it out on his own." At the same time, Grid, who was sitting on the bench, grabbed his head and said in frustration, "Maybe I should really try something else. There must be something I'm good at, right?" After some thought about what he could have done at his age to be good at his job, Grid exclaimed in frustration, looking up, "Is there nothing I could do that I would be good at?" Leaning back, Grid fell on the bushes behind him, calming down after his nervous exclamations. The boy said slyly, "Well, let's try to play again." Then Chulho, who was heading home in his car after seeing something interesting and taking a day off, said confidently that he definitely had no sense of proportion. Arriving home, Grid sat back down in his game capsule and said, "Okay, this is the last game, but I still want to try to play as a legendary class." Inspecting his capsule from the inside to make sure it was in good working order, Grid added confidently, "As long as the capsule is in good condition, everything should go well. I'm counting on you, buddy." Closing himself up in his full immersion device, the guy mentally said, "Starting the game once again. I'm going to win back all the money I spent here, no matter what it takes." After pressing the start button, a system notification appeared in front of the player, which indicated the connection to Satisfy and the download window. After a while, Grid appeared in the forest because his original respawn point was destroyed due to the failure of the mission with Asher. Looking around to determine exactly where he was, Grid said in surprise that, "Where am I now? It doesn't look like yesterday's cave, that I was really kicked out of the city." Walking through the forest with trees that had no leaves and the atmosphere around them was rather depressing. Grid said thoughtfully, "It's still Patreon, but I've never been here, so they just can't give me a break. Kicking me out for a simple betrayal is a bit much for me." Walking through some unknown forest, Grid said thoughtfully, "I need to find some kind of sign to understand where I am now." And suddenly he noticed something on his way. This something was a temple that stood right in his path. And of course, Grid could not just pass by and headed straight for it. In that temple, a ritual was just being held where they were trying to sacrifice a girl who had been kidnapped by the followers for their dark deeds. Hearing some spells being read by a follower of the temple, Grid wandered through the corridors and wondered what kind of place this was. Noticing a girl tied to a cross and 4 men in cloaks saying something incomprehensible, Grid nervously said in his head, "Temples are meant for level players. It's too dangerous here." Opening his stats to see what he had gained from the legendary title, Grid said disappointedly, "I have the stats of a bug. I'm really at the first level, so it must not be a bug in the system." Noticing the system notification in front of him while viewing the characteristics, which said that the chance of an additional option when creating weapons has increased the chance of successfully using the improvement of your item, you can wear all things, but it will be penalized for this. Immediately after that, Grid found his old items in his inventory and shouted "Equip." Immediately after that, his old items were put on him, and a system notification appeared that said Mammon's 2-handed sword was obtained. Mangel's armor was obtained. Seeing that everything was really on him, the boy exclaimed in amazement, "I can re-equip myself with level 60 items. I needed 200 points of power to put them on." Immediately after that, Grid saw system notifications in front of him that said penalties were applied due to imbalance of characteristics, attack power reduced by additional effects on armor protection, reduced by additional parameters. On seeing this, the boy was shocked and said, "But the penalties are obviously nothing is free, but still." Putting on the powerful armor even with the penalty, Grid said happily, looking at the sword, "The attack power of the sword is still points, and the armor will give me points of defense. The first level items will barely give me the same effect. So even with the penalties, it is still 10 times better." Kneeling down with joy, Grid mentally said, "Legendary classes are just incredible to allow such high-end equipment. Heaven has blessed me." Immediately after his joy, Grid suddenly realized one rather unpleasant truth. Then he mentally said, "Wait, but if this is a level dungeon, then everything around me is of the same level. The game is trying to kiss me and kill me at the same time." At the same time, somewhere on the sacrificial table, the temple followers continued their dark rulings, conjuring up the girl while she screamed loudly, trying to call someone for help. Observing the situation in the sacrificial room, Grid said thoughtfully, "If we are in a temple of Than, they must be monks of Yatan, trying to perform magic." Looking at the monks, who were quite numerous in this temple, Grid thought to himself, staying here could be equivalent to death. A small scratch from one of them would definitely kill me. Even though he didn't feel anyone sneaking up behind him, Grid said confidently, "As long as I don't get caught, I should be fine." It shouldn't be hard. No sooner had he said that than he felt a hand on his shoulder and a voice saying, "You." Swinging his sword in surprise as he turned around, Grid missed the man and heard the voice say, "Hey boy, calm down. Did you really want to kill me or what?" Taking off his cloak to reveal who he was, the man who had snuck up on him from behind said, "I am a secret guard under the command of Count Stam. My name is Doran, and judging by the way you're hiding, it's fair to say you're not one of them." After a few words and discussing some topics, Grid turned his gaze to the girl and asked, "So you mean to tell me that the girl on the altar is Count Stam's daughter, Irene?" To which Doran replied, "That's right. She was kidnapped while traveling." After discussing what exactly had happened and how Doran had spoken to Grid despite the situation, it was quite nice to have someone on my side. Hearing this, Grid said in surprise that you mean, before he could finish, he saw the S-Class assignment request in front of him. As soon as he saw it, he immediately turned his head to the side and said with a disgruntled face, "Another S-Class task. So he was an NPC, damn it." Giving Grid a request for help with the task, Doran said most people have fear in their eyes. But you seem quite brave hearing that Grid asked in surprise that this place was like that. Looking at his hand, Grid thoughtfully spoke in his head, not understanding why he was not affected by the effect of intimidation. A weakling like me should not be able to withstand this. Is it because of some innate ability? Immediately after these words, Grid saw a system notification in front of him that said the additional ability of self-control points cannot be allocated to this ability. The probability of falling into an abnormal state has radically decreased. The recovery rate has increased. Then Grid added in surprise, "And perhaps this is why I will need to study all the subtleties of my class in more detail." Immediately after these thoughts, Grid looked at Doran, who was smiling happily, and said to him, "To think that a warrior like you would help me must mean that the gods are on Count Stam's side. Thank you for your help in these difficult times." Hearing these words, Grid replied in surprise, "Wait, where did you get that from? I'm not going to help you in this matter no matter what." Hearing Doran's refusal, he decided not to give up so easily. After a short pause, he repeated, "Let's do it together." To which Grid nervously replied, "I'm not going to do that." Trying to get away from Doran, Grid turned away from him and heard a confused voice say, "Wait, you're leaving me alone to fight these dark mages?" To which he replied, "That's not my problem." Immediately after the next refusal, Grid bit his lip and mentally said, "Although I'm not too eager to lose the 3,000 gold for the help I got here because of another S-rank quest, it would be pointless to take on another of the same class." Hearing another refusal, Doran was not going to give up so easily and said again, "Aren't you the one who can resist the dark energy? I can't handle all this alone. Please help me." Hearing Doran's request, Grid exclaimed angrily, "Damn man, that's not cool. I'm okay only because of my luck, that's all. I'm at level. If I fail again, I'll be at level." Hearing another rejection, Doran tried to ask for help again, saying, "Please help me. The life of a young lady is in grave danger." To which Grid replied angrily, "How many times do I have to tell you I can't help you?" To which Doran replied, "Stop lying. I can see you're strong." Then Grid added, "You're not." The next moment, Grid saw a system notification that said the quest to save the Count's daughter was activated, and when he saw it, Grid nervously exclaimed, "Why?" Seeing that he had accepted his request for help because of an accident, Doran said to Grid, "Now that you have become an enemy of the Temple of Yathan, we are in the same boat." Hearing this, Grid shouted in anger at who said that. Noticing that Grid had dropped a stone on the head of one of the monks during a verbal altercation and killed him, Doran said, "The monks of the Yathan Temple are fanatics who practice human sacrifice, and you attacked them so they will not let you go easily." Preparing to fight his enemies, Doran pulled out his knives and said, "This is our fate. There is no point in complaining now, so just accept this fact with dignity. I will clear the way for you to save the girl." Noticing a couple of intruders in his temple, one of the monks angrily shouted, These blasphemers dare to harm the children of Yatan. Kill them. Seeing how many enemies were coming at them, Grid nervously exclaimed, "Oh shit, there are too many of them. It seems that it is time for me to get out of here." Receiving the order from their leader, the entire sect of Yatan monks rushed at Doran and Grid, who accidentally killed one of their comrades. When Grid saw this, he was frightened and began to think about what to do, because he had no hope of defeating his enemies. Shielding himself from the enemies with his hand, he thought, "Even though I have all the equipment on, the restrictions imposed do not allow my characteristics to rise above the 34th level. I will die even if they just breathe on me." Crouching on the floor and grabbing his head with his hands, Grid was hysterical and frightened, saying in his head, "Oh shit, am I really going to die like this today?" But suddenly, he saw one of his defeated enemies fall down beside him. Continuing their attack, the monks of the Temple of Yatan continued to run with their weapons at Doran, trying to finish off the insolent man who had invaded their sanctuary. However, Doran was quite a capable man and easily defeated the enemies who tried to finish him off with their combat knives. After a while, one could see that all the enemies had already been defeated, and Doran had managed to deal with them all on his own without any help. Realizing that the trouble was over, Grid said in amazement in his head, "Is he really that strong? Who would have thought that he would be able to move so fast in such a small and tight space? There is a chance that I will not die if I am lucky." Gratified that his friend was so strong, Grid suddenly heard more followers of the temple appear behind him, angrily shouting, "Kill the Anti-Cross! Kill him!" And he added nervously, "Or if I'm not lucky." Having dealt with the crowd of enemies who were coming at them from the front, Doran arrived at Grid and said, "If we continue at the same pace, it will not lead us anywhere. Don't you think so?" The boy nervously replied, "I don't know." Immediately after that, Doran pushed his friend forward to run to save the girl and said, "I know you want to finish this as soon as possible and not waste your time on this trifle." And Grid said in surprise that he had been pushed. Falling down from a fairly high altitude, Grid screamed out in fright, "I'm done now. I'm definitely done. I'm going to die here." After flying half the distance, Doran used his skill to soften the fall and said levitation. Landing softly on his feet, Doran said in surprise, "This spell can prevent you from falling. You're quite modest if you think such a simple spell is something special." Putting his hand to his chest, Grid said happily, "And yet, I am still alive because of you." While he was rejoicing in being alive, Doran told him, "And now it was time to show the very power you had been hiding." Once in the middle of the hall where the sacrifice was taking place, Doran announced that the mission to save the young maiden had begun. Seeing the enemies in front of him, one of the main followers of the temple shouted to the others to kill all the heretics. And immediately after these words, all the monks present began to recite spells, saying to the souls of the underworld, "We fulfill your wishes." Seeing what the enemies were doing, Grid said in fright that they were doing some kind of witchcraft, and Doran replied that it was dark magic, which would be quite problematic if we did nothing. Immediately after these words, Doran rushed into battle, destroying all the monks who stood in front of him, angrily shouting, "Did you really think I would just let you finish your spell?" Noticing that the enemy is destroying those who recite the spell first, the leader among the crowd of followers shouted out, "Children of Yathan, buy some time. Kill the heretics at any cost." Standing behind his comrade who was single-handedly dealing with the crowd of enemies, Grid said in his head, "He's doing well despite the level of the temple, and Doran is a pretty good fighter." Watching all the work being done by himself, Grid said in an ominous tone in his head, "If this continues, then maybe I will complete this quest thanks to the NPCs. Then the only thing I can do." Without thinking twice, Grid mentally said to support him, and then raising his hand up, the boy joyfully exclaimed, "Keep it up, Doran. You are my hope and support." The next moment, Grid, who was fighting against his enemies, heard them finish their spell, saying, "Your mind and will be suppressed, and you will become a doll with an empty soul." And Doran nervously exclaimed, "Ouch, spell." Seeing his friend completely covered in dark magic from the spell recited by Grid's followers, He nervously spoke up, taking back his words. Unable to contain his joy, one of the temple's followers smiled ominously and exclaimed, "Look what heretics who live miserably under the feet of the Great Ones will become." The next moment, Doran prevented the spell from reaching him and harming him. I confidently said, "I am the shadow of Stam Doran." Having activated some hidden power that protected him from the curse of the monks of the Temple of Jotun, Doran angrily added the Sword of Mist that protects the family. I must serve to the very end. Seeing that his comrade could still fight even though a powerful manipulation spell was cast on him, Grid wondered in his mind if he had broken through the black magic. Was he a hero or what? Seeing that the enemies were beginning to say the words of some spell again, Doran shouted angrily that they were preparing to use some spell on me again. Preparing to destroy the remaining enemies who were still alive, Doran shouted angrily at those who dared to attack the Stain family. Stopping in place after he had gained enough speed, Doran threw the throwing knives out of his hands and shouted that there would never be forgiveness or a second chance. Noticing the knives flying directly at them, the head of the group of temple followers scaredly shouted, "Hey, beware!" Immediately after these words, gathering all his surviving comrades around him, the monk commander prepared to die. But a shield appeared right in front of them, which repelled the attack. At the same time, Doran, who saw what had just happened, said in surprise that the shield was there. The next moment, someone's voice appeared from the other side of the hall. It was the Blood Witch who had protected the monks after this grand appearance. She said, "I'm afraid you can't go any further because protecting this ritual is my S-rank quest." Looking at the pair of men who would fight with her in this mission, she said in surprise, "That's why this mission is so high-ranked. It turns out that my opponent will be the hero Doran." Immediately after these words, heading further to the altar so as not to accidentally lose sight of the girl, the Bloody Witch added, "It's been a long time since my blood boiled so much." Preparing for the battle against a couple of men who wanted to return the young lady from the hands of thieves and interrupt the ritual, the Bloody Witch said, "Let me fight you. My name is Yura." Ranked first in the world ranking of black magic players and fifth in the global ranking, Yura is a South Korean player, a world sensation, a talented beauty who often appears on television. Anticipating a great battle with a strong opponent, Yura happily said what a great opportunity to fight against Doran himself. It should be quite interesting. Being a master among all dark wizards, Yura single-handedly surpassed the standard characteristics of her class due to her unmatched ability to control magic. So what the hell was she doing here? Having made the first attack on the boys, she forced them to run around the room so that her attacks could not reach them and accidentally finish them off, while Doran was waiting for the moment to attack. Having made several attacks on her opponents, Yura suddenly stopped and looked at Grid and said happily, "So you were the user who accepted this task." Smiling slyly, the young dark magic master said happily, "This place was just perfect to try out my new skills secretly from the others, and it was all thanks to you." Immediately after these words, Yura turned her attention to the armor of the guy standing in front of her and said, "However, I see you are wearing the armor of Mengel and using the two-handed sword of Mammon. Isn't this a tough battle for a level 80 player?" Looking at the enemy that suddenly appeared in front of them, Grid nervously said in his head, "The level is completely wrong, and the leaders of the ranking are at a completely different level. But here," immediately after these thoughts, Grid smiled slyly and said confidently, "Don't get too excited, I'm a hero. It's not going to be easy even for a top player, so don't get too excited." Hearing these words from Grid, Yura used her magic and said, "Actually, I wanted to ask you for something." Immediately after these words, the girl prepared for a serious battle with Doran, confidently said I needed an opponent so that I could properly celebrate the receipt of the 230th level. Hearing these words from his opponent, Doran prepared for the battle and took out his combat knives and said to Grid, "Warrior, step aside. I'll try to deal with her myself." Rushing at the Bloody Witch who suddenly appeared right in front of them and was going to prevent them from saving the girl, Doran said, "There is no room for doubt if you are at least one step faster than your opponent." Throwing his knives at the enemy, Doran confidently added, "Then there is always at least some chance to defeat even the most powerful enemy." Having defended herself and dodged the enemy's attack, the girl prepared to use one of her spells on the enemy and said, "These are typical words of any hero, but I really don't like this." The next moment, Doran saw that his feet were stuck in something rather sticky that prevented him from moving normally, and then the hero nervously said in his head, "My feet." Immediately after these thoughts, the man took out a pair of knives from his inventory and cut the cords that were binding his legs and shouted menacingly, as if I could really be held by such a useless spell. Slicing through any further tentacles that reached out to grab him and restrict his movements, Doran angrily exclaimed as he continued to approach his opponent, "Let me repay you." Having made the enemy work hard to avoid her spell, the Blood Witch Yura said happily, "Well, now you've certainly spent a significant amount of your energy, quite impressively." Doran confidently exclaimed, "I'll be strong enough to deal with creatures like you," as he rushed back to the attack, dodging the tentacles that appeared in his path. As soon as the man said this, he heard a strange noise above him, and looking up, he noticed globs of blood above him, and then said in surprise, "So that's where it really came from." Preparing to deal with the hero with just one spell, the Bloody Witch said in a haughty tone, "You can thank me. I will take away all the weight that blood creates in your body." The next moment, a pair of red balls that approached the man's body began to drain every last drop of blood from him. Watching his friend suffer from the magic attack of his rival, Grid, who was standing nearby, nervously said in his head, "Damn it, I can't help you if you die. I'll die too, you know that." Drawing all the blood she could from the hero she had to confront, the Bloody Witch confidently said, "This is an advanced skill that uses all my mana. I'll finish it." Before she could finish her sentence, she noticed that her magic spell had ceased to work. Doran used his last trump card and said menacingly, "You little arrogant witch. Now I will show you the power that has protected this family for hundreds of years." Realizing what had just happened, the Bloody Witch, completely shocked by what she saw, nervously exclaimed, "How is it possible that you could use a level 1 hypnosis skill?" Looking at his friend, who had just managed to defend himself against a powerful attack from his opponent, Grid nervously asked what just happened. "I hope you're okay." Hearing the question from his friend, Doran looked at the ring on his hand and said, "Yes, thanks to this ring, his abilities are at least unique, although his defense is not perfect. It is enough to resist her spells and recover faster." Upon learning what a wonderful item his friend Grid possessed, he didn't even hesitate to say, "Give it to me." Hearing such a request from the boy, Doran said nervously, "You know, that was pretty straightforward." Immediately after that, Doran prepared himself to confront the enemy again and said confidently, "In any case, it is not omnipotent. It is time to make it retreat, warrior." Taking up a fighting stance, Doran fired several of his combat knives at the witch to hit her from a distance. However, his attack was ineffective, as the Bloody Witch neutralized all the knives that flew at her with one swing of her bloody staff. Having repelled the enemy's attack after he should have been dead after her last attack, the girl gritted her teeth and nervously said in her head, "He was stronger than I thought." Immediately after these thoughts, the Bloody Witch thought about her battle tactics and said in her head, "Even if I use the last fortress, they should not be underestimated." The next moment, turning her gaze to Grid, Yura added worriedly, "The only variable I can't take into account is the warrior standing over there, but how dangerous a low-level user can be in this area." While Yura was thinking about how to deal with her enemies, Grid noticed a trio of monks behind him who had just appeared almost out of nowhere. As soon as Grid noticed the enemies behind him, he immediately went to Doran, nervously exclaiming, "Sir Doran, those cultists are here again." Seeing that help had arrived to help her, thanks to which the enemies lost their vigilance, Yura prepared for a powerful attack and angrily said in her head how annoying it was. "I didn't want to do this quest with the help of NPCs, but in any case, Now it was my turn. Preparing for a powerful volley that was sure to sweep the enemies out of her way, Yura confidently said, "Now it's over, Doran. This is my last spell. I'll use the maximum power of my mana." Immediately after these words, the girl shouted out and fired a volley of magic spells directly at Doran, a dark storm. At the same moment, Grid was running away from the monks to hide from them with the help of his friend, and did not even notice the powerful magic spell flying right at him. At the same time, Doran was nervously looking at what was coming towards him and said all the skins in his head before he could finish. And Grid appeared in front of him and covered him with his body. The next moment, a powerful explosion sounded. It was a direct hit, and all the enemies should have been dead as a result of such a powerful spell. Dodging the scorched debris that flew in her direction, Yura said, "That's a little too much for use inside the temple, but at least they're dead, and now I need to use it." As soon as the effects of the magical attack dissipated, Doran saw Grid, who was completely unharmed after such a powerful blow, and still stood on his feet in front of him. Noticing that the enemies were still alive even after such a nervous, bloody witch gritted her teeth and mentally said, "How come there is someone so strong that I don't know who the hell this guy is?"